Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through 135 wild and haunting facts about Bloodborne's most unforgettable NPCs, the broken hunters, the tragic queens, the obsessed old men, and the monsters wearing human faces. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The dream that trapped its maker. Gehrman did not simply build the hunter's dream. He is the hunter's dream. When he made a contract with the Moon Presence, that vast, pale entity lurking somewhere above the waking world, the dream took shape from the architecture of his own subconscious. It resembled his abandoned workshop in Iyanam, because that is the space Gehrman's mind reached for. The place where he had first taught young hunters to sharpen their blades and steady their hands against the night. He believed he was creating a sanctuary for those who came after him. What he created instead was a cage built in the shape of a home. For every hunter who passes through and eventually escapes, either granted mercy by Gehrman's scythe or freed through the player's own defiance, Gehrman himself remains, bound by the terms of his own bargain. He cannot leave. He cannot die. He can only sit in his wheelchair, tending the garden that grows in a world that does not fully exist, waiting for the next weary traveler to arrive at the lantern. She no longer dreams. Here is the detail in Eileen's lore that makes her more than just an interesting side quest. If you fight her and she kills you, she has a specific line. You still have dreams. Tell the little doll I said hello. This is not a throwaway farewell. It is a confirmation that Eileen was once, like the player, a hunter bound to the dream, subject to the cycle of death and return. She knows about the doll because she spoke with the doll herself once, in her own time cycling through the nightmare. At some point, she was released from the dream, the same mercy Gehrman offers hunters at the end of their hunt, and chose not to return to the cycle. But that freedom comes with a cost. When she appears at the base of the Grand Cathedral, grievously wounded, and tells the player that she no longer dreams, she is telling them that if she dies now, she simply dies. There is no going back. Her quest, from the beginning, has been the last thing she will ever do. The skin he wore as confession. Brador was a foreign hunter who joined the Healing Church's service. At some point, one of his companions transformed into a cleric beast, one of those enormous, agonized creatures that represent the full expression of what the scourge does to a hunter's body when it goes wrong. Brador killed his companion. That much was necessary. What happened next was not. He skinned the beast's hide, kept the scalp, and began wearing it as a hood. His set is called Brador's Testimony, and the description makes clear that this is exactly what the name implies. He was testifying to what had happened, carrying the evidence of it on his body, unable to discard the thing he had done. When he brought this testimony to the Healing Church, they looked at what he was wearing and what he knew, and made a calculation. Too dangerous to release, too useful to discard. So they gave him a bell and a cell and a purpose, and that was the shape of the rest of his life. The obsession behind the doll, Lady Maria, was one of Gehrman's most gifted students, a young woman of Cainhurst noble blood who had come down from her aristocratic world to hunt at the side of the man who first gave beasts a reason to fear the night. Gehrman was her teacher, her mentor, and, if the item descriptions are read carefully, something more on his side. He was besotted with her. After Maria vanished in the aftermath of the terrible events at the fishing hamlet, Gehrman found himself drowning in the strange twilight of the hunter's dream, with no companion, and a grief he could not put into words. So he made one. He crafted the plain doll in Maria's exact likeness, sewing her attire with a care that the small hair ornament description calls bordering on mania. He even kept one of Maria's real hair ornaments hidden in a cupboard in the workshop, a private relic of someone who was never coming back. When he finished the doll and looked at her face, she looked exactly right. But she was not Maria. She had none of Maria's fire, none of her edge, none of whatever intangible quality it was that had made the real woman so vivid and irreplaceable. The tear-blood gem reads that perhaps the doll's creator had wished for just such a friend, albeit in vain. The fear fire made. One of the game's most subtle environmental details lies in the behavioral programming of the beast patients in Old Yharnam. Raise a torch while standing near these creatures and they flinch back. They do not attack. They press away from the light and the heat, the way a person presses away from something they remember hurting them. Old Yharnam was burned. The people inside it were burned with it. The beast they became still carry that memory in their bodies even after everything else human about them is gone. Jura's line, "The things you hunt, they're not beasts, they're people," becomes almost unbearably precise in light of this. They are afraid of fire because they remember burning. They do not know what they remember, but the body remembers even when the mind cannot. The beggar's last argument. When the suspicious beggar is finally confronted in his true form. When the attacks begin and the disguise drops and the creature that was pretending to need shelter reveals itself. His final words carry an argument that the game takes seriously even while presenting him as an enemy. He chastises the player for killing beasts. He observes that hunters are more bloodthirsty and merciless than the beasts, that beasts hunt from need and hunger, while hunters hunt because they have classified something as a beast and therefore deserving of death. It is a critique that Jura also makes, that the entirety of Old Yharnam structurally makes, that the game's lore has been building toward throughout. The suspicious beggar is a monster who was found feeding on the dead. He is also not wrong about the hunters. Bloodborne holds both of these things simultaneously and does not resolve them into a lesson. The sleeping confession. With enough insight accumulated, something extraordinary and quietly devastating can happen in the hunter's dream. Wander close enough to Gehrman's cabin at the right moment, and you can hear him muttering in his sleep. He is dreaming within a dream, calling out to Master Willem and to Lawrence, two of the men most connected to the horror that claimed Yharnam. The words are fragmented, desperate, the private grief of a man who has been alone for longer than anyone should have to be. He begs them to save him. He pleads to be freed. In his sleep, the composure he wears during waking conversation falls completely away, and what remains underneath is something raw and painful. The voice of the first hunter, who was also the first prisoner. Players who find this moment tend to describe it as one of the most affecting sequences in the entire game. Not a cutscene, not a boss fight, just an old man talking in his sleep in a place where no one was ever meant to hear him. The music box and the last night, Father Gascoigne, was not always what you meet at the beginning of Bloodborne. He was a great hunter, one of the most capable of his generation, a foreign-born warrior who came to Yharnam and took up the hunt with a ferocity that earned him significant standing. He had a wife named Viola and 2 daughters. The music box that Viola's younger daughter gives the player, and that can be used during the Gascoigne boss fight, is not simply a gameplay mechanic. It plays a song his wife loved, a song so tied to his identity as a husband and a father that even in the depths of his transformation, When his body is becoming something that is no longer human, hearing it causes him to hesitate. For just a moment, the beast that is consuming him pauses, and something underneath it, something that remembers Viola, surfaces. It does not save him, but it shows what was there before the hunt took everything. The Lawrence theory. Among the more compelling lore arguments connected to Brador is the question of which companion he killed. The scalp on Brador's hood belongs to a cleric beast. Given the size of the scalp and what is implied about cleric beasts during the early history of the Scourge, when they were reportedly smaller, many lore readers have concluded that the compatriot Brador killed was Lawrence himself, the founder of the Healing Church, who eventually becomes the massive burning cleric beast encountered in the DLC's Grand Cathedral. The weapon Brador carries is called the Bloodletter, a name that echoes the bloodletting beast, a creature whose cracked skull location mirrors what is visible on the beastly form of Lawrence. Nothing confirms this directly, but if correct, it means Brador has been wearing the founder of the Healing Church as a hood throughout his entire imprisonment, and the church that gave him that bell and that cell was protecting the secret of what had become of its own founding father. The voice that links them. Lady Maria and the Plain Doll share the same voice actress in both the English and Japanese versions of Bloodborne. In English, both are voiced by Iveta Muradasilova, who also voiced the Maiden in Black in Demon's Souls. The doll's voice is softer, more measured, more patient. All the rougher edges sanded away. Maria's voice in the Astral Clock Tower carries something harder, more guarded, the sound of someone who has seen terrible things and made decisions she could not undo. Both voices come from the same source, and the difference between them is, in its own way, a character study. This is the woman who was, and this is the echo that was built to approximate her. Neither is a perfect version of the other, but the shared voice is the game's most elegant way of saying that they are, at the core, the same person. The dying words of a gentle thing. The Uden Chapel dweller's final dialogue, if the player attacks and kills him, is brief enough to miss. I just wanted to help people. If his questline has been fully completed first, having brought all possible survivors to safety, the words shift to something even quieter. I only wanted to be your friend. These lines recontextualize his entire presence. He looks alarming. He speaks in wet, labored syllables. He is visually coded by the game's design language as something that should not be trusted. But the thing underneath all of that is not complicated at all. He wanted to keep people safe. He wanted company. In a game full of hunters who consumed too much blood, scholars who reached for too much knowledge, and priests who justified too much cruelty, the chapel dweller is something almost embarrassingly simple. A frightened creature trying to be useful. The death he chose. Returned to Cathedral Ward after visiting Alfred in the throne room, and he can be found slumped against the wall outside the church, where he was first met. Dead, wearing the crown of Martyr Lugarius, in the posture of a man who knelt and did not get back up. He dropped the Radiant's Oath on his way down, the rune of the Executioner Covenant, a final gesture toward the Covenant whose mission he has now completed. The game does not editorialize. It does not tell you whether Alfred's death was suicide or something else, whether the blood-drunk state he was clearly in at the throne room simply continued until there was nothing left of him, or whether he made a deliberate choice to die before the hunter's madness could take more. He is simply there, in the attire of his dead master, having arranged himself into the shape of a memorial for a life that was never really his own. The pregnancy in the clinic. If the player does not kill the imposter Yosefka before the blood moon rises, a final scene becomes available. She is found at the top of the clinic on her knees, racked with pain, and she alludes to a sudden pregnancy. She has apparently become pregnant with something she cannot explain and cannot stop. A condition strongly implied to be connected to the Great One Odin, the formless, presence-based entity associated with blood and reproduction throughout the game's cosmology. Killing her at this point yields one of the game's 4 third umbilical cord items, the 3 of which are needed to access the true final ending. She is the game's most elaborately rendered example of what the Healing Church's research ultimately produces. It reaches for transcendence and delivers suffering and madness in the shape of something new. The Cainhurst noble who chose the hunt. Lady Maria was born into the aristocracy of Cainhurst Castle, the isolated fortress ruled by Queen Annalise and populated by the Vilebloods, nobles who had turned to a form of blood that the Healing Church considered an abomination. For someone of Maria's background, taking up the hunt under Gehrman was not a natural career path. She crossed lines of blood and class to serve alongside hunters who had none of her advantages, and she was good enough at the work to become one of the most respected hunters of her generation. Whatever drove her away from Cainhurst and toward the world of the hunt was significant enough that she never went back. She chose the blood-soaked work of a hunter over the blood-soaked luxury of her birthright. The window that broke from inside. After Rom is defeated and the blood moon rises, Gilbert's window is broken, but pushed outward, not inward. The frame is splintered from the inside. A beast patient wanders the area just outside. This is Gilbert. The transformation he had been holding off for so long, finally completed. The blood that bought him time simply ran out of time. The window broken from inside is one of those small environmental storytelling details that Bloodborne places without comment. The man who kept the shutters closed is gone, and what came out through those shutters was not him anymore. The language of a vanished era. Annalise is the only character in Bloodborne who speaks in early modern English. The grammatical register of texts like the King James Bible and the plays of Shakespeare. A form of the language that predates the modern conventions of contracting and simplifying. She says thee and thou and our as a royal plural. Her syntax is formal, archaic, and immediately distinctive. This is a choice that communicates something about her age. Annalise has been sitting in that hidden room for so long that the world outside has moved on linguistically while she remained exactly where she was. She is not performing archaism. She is simply speaking the way she learned to speak, in an era that no longer exists outside the walls of Cainhurst Castle. Adela's jealous eye. Here is a detail about Adela the nun that most players never notice because it requires watching her during a specific interaction. Every time the player speaks with Ariana in the Uden Chapel, Adela, if she is also present, watches. The animation is unmistakable once you are looking for it. She turns her head and tracks the conversation with an attention that is not passive. She is monitoring. She is aware of Ariana's blood, of the fact that the player is receiving it, and she is cataloguing each interaction. Most players only learn about Adela's capacity for violence after the fact, when Ariana turns up dead. But the game placed the warning in the room from the beginning, in the form of a nun who cannot look away from someone else's transaction. The Eastern warrior and the oath that broke him. Old hunter Yamamura arrived in Yharnam from a distant eastern land carrying a specific purpose. He was pursuing a beast for what his attire description calls honorable revenge. Something had been taken from him. He found Valter's League and took the impurity oath, receiving the ability to see vermin and joining the organization's mission. He hunted, he crushed vermin, and then, at some point, he looked too directly into impurity itself, stared straight into it, according to his clothing description, and whatever he saw broke something in him that could not be repaired. He is found in the nightmare's underground cell, smashing his head rhythmically against the wall, reciting a fragment of what seems like a creed or a poem in a continuous loop, unable to be spoken to. The only thing the player can do is end his misery. Killing him allows him to be summoned as an ally in later battles, as though death, for Yamamura, was the mercy that restored some version of purpose. The quickening. Something remarkable happens when Gehrman rises from his wheelchair to fight you. The limping, hunched figure who has spent the entire game bent over a cane suddenly moves with a speed and fluidity that feels impossible for his age, his apparent infirmity, his physical appearance. This is not just a gameplay escalation. It reflects something true about Gehrman, within the logic of the world. He is the first hunter. Whatever the scourge has done to other people, whatever the hunt has cost him in grief and isolation, it has also honed him. Beneath the wheelchair and the worn clothing is a fighter who has been practicing his art since before any other hunter drew a blade. The old hunter bone item, found on a grave in the abandoned old workshop, references this same art, noting that it belonged to an apprentice of old Gehrman, who mastered the technique. The implication is that quickening was taught as part of the original hunter tradition, passed from the first hunter to those who trained under him, and that Gehrman himself still carries the fullest expression of it. Something practiced across a lifetime, and then some has made part of his body, rather than simply a skill he carries. The cage that traps the mind. Mikolash, host of the nightmare, was most likely a student of Bergenwerth before his obsessions drove him away from Master Willem's methods and toward the church's research. He became the leader of the School of Mensis, a group dedicated to making contact with the Great Ones through the Mensis cage, a metal construction worn on the head that allegedly traps the bearer's thoughts and creates a channel for communication with higher entities. The cage worked. It also destroyed him. By the time the player encounters him, Mikolash is trapped in the nightmare of Mensis, running from the hunter through library corridors, reciting prayers to Kos in a state that is past madness and into something more like ecstatic, permanent rapture. He got what he was asking for. He just cannot come back from having gotten it. The Beast Eater who founded a league, Walter, master of the league, did not begin as a hunter. He was one of a group of foreign constables, law enforcement from outside Yharnam, who tracked a beast all the way into the city. The beast killed all of his companions. Walter was the only survivor, and in his grief and rage, he did something no rational person would do. He killed the beast and ate it whole, consuming it entirely as an act of raw vengeance for the friends it had taken from him. This act of consumption changed him. It opened his eyes, literally in the game's metaphysical sense, to something he had not been able to perceive before. Vermin, small creatures visible only to those with the impurity rune, which writhe inside all living things and are, in Walter's understanding, the root of human corruption. He founded the League to crush them. The first words. She says, when Lady Maria finally stirs from the chair where she has been sitting, apparently dead, and grabs the player's arm as they approach, her first words before the fight begins are, a corpse should be left well alone. On the surface, This is a warning to the hunter who has just disturbed her rest. But the phrase carries a second layer of weight. Maria and the hunters who followed Gehrman to the fishing hamlet violated a corpse there, the body of the Great One Corse, whose remains they ransacked for eldritch knowledge. The atrocity at the fishing hamlet is what Maria could never forgive herself for, the act that eventually led her to throw her weapons into a well and seal herself in the clock tower. When she says a corpse should be left well alone, she may be speaking as much from personal history as from immediate warning. The Henrik who outlived his purpose. Henrik's description calls him the taciturn old hunter who was once partners with Father Gascoigne, and it notes that their fierce and gallant partnership led to Henrik's tragically long life. That phrase, tragically long, is doing a great deal of work in a very small space. Henrik is old in a way that suggests he should have died long ago by any reasonable measure. He did not, because the partnership he had with Gascoigne was a kind of engine that kept both of them going. When Gascoigne fell to the scourge, Henrik lost the thing that gave the hunt its context, its companionship, its meaning. But the hunting habit remained. By the time the player finds him at the tomb of Uden, he has been blood drunk for long enough that what he is doing cannot properly be called hunting. He is simply compulsion in an old man's body, attacking anyone who comes close. The prayer he never stopped, Mikolash's most famous line, "Ah, Kos," or some say Kosm, "Do you hear our prayers?" is not simply the rambling of a broken mind. It is the ongoing work of the school of Mensis, even after its leader is trapped in the nightmare and beyond coherent thought. He is still praying. He is still reaching. The prayer is not a memory or a habit. It is an active communication attempt being conducted by a man who has lost everything except the conviction that the Great Ones are listening and will eventually answer. His death quote is, "Now I'm waking up. I'll forget everything." He was not experiencing the nightmare as suffering. He was experiencing it as home. Ariana and the bloodline. She never claimed. Ariana is introduced as a woman of the night living in an alley in the cathedral ward, someone who has been selling what she can sell to survive in a city that has been burning itself alive. What the lore slowly reveals is that Ariana's blood is not ordinary. Her noble dress, an item she wears that should have been well beyond her apparent station, traces back to the bloodline of Cainhurst. Her blood, when offered to the player, heals and sustains in a way that Adela's blood describes as tainted, and the item description notes it resembles precisely what was once forbidden by the healing church. Based on what we know about Cainhurst's forbidden blood and the dress she carries, the most coherent reading is that Ariana is a descendant of the Cainhurst nobles, someone whose aristocratic lineage has come down through generations to this alley in this burning city, carrying in her veins something the church classified as corruption. The game never confirms this outright, but the evidence points in one direction. The trap laid with glittering coins, the mechanics of Patch's trap in the Nightmare Frontier, are a masterpiece of misdirection. He lays a trail of shining coins along the ground, leading toward a cold-blood flower bud near the edge of a cliff. Players trained by the game itself to follow shining coins as path markers will follow the trail automatically. Patches waits on a wall above, watching. When the player reaches for the item, a cutscene plays, and he simply steps forward and pushes them over the edge into the poison swamp below. He does not make a speech. He does not gloat at length. He just pushes, and then laughs, in the light and easy way of someone for whom this particular act is entirely routine. The guilt she buried, Maria's presence in the astral clock tower and her entrapment within the hunter's nightmare are directly connected to what happened at the fishing hamlet. She participated in acts against the villagers there and against the body of Kos that she could not reconcile with her sense of herself. After the hamlet, Maria threw away her own weapons, cast them into a well according to the Rakuyo item description, as though renouncing the tools of a violence she could no longer justify. Her position when the player finds her is that of someone who appears to have taken her own life. She is seated, apparently still, with blood staining the front of her shirt, in a pattern consistent with a wound to the throat. Whether this is confirmed cause of death or simply what the presentation implies, the meaning lands the same way. She could not unmake what she had done. She could only stop the man who came to die in Yharnam. Gilbert is one of Bloodborne's smallest stories, and one of its most quietly devastating. He is never seen. The player interacts with him entirely through a window in central Yharnam, his voice reaching through closed shutters. He came to the city from somewhere outside it, searching for a cure to an illness that was already consuming him. The Healing Church's blood ministration gave him something close to what he wanted. Not a cure, but a delay. The blood slowed his transformation and bought him time he would not otherwise have had. He is genuinely, specifically grateful for this. He does not resent the city or its church. He accepts that what he has is incurable and considers himself fortunate to have found a way to die human, rather than as whatever the scourge would have made him. The pregnancy no one predicted. After the death of Mikolash, host of the nightmare, Ariana can be found no longer in the chapel, but in the aqueduct, between the tomb of Eden and the cathedral ward lamps, deep in shadow, clearly unwell. She has become pregnant. The child she eventually delivers is not human. It is connected to Eden, the formless Great One associated with the tomb above her current location, the entity whose name is written on the walls of the buildings near where she sheltered. The lore note found at Bergenwerth says that when the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, and when the Great Ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child. Ariana's body became that womb. Her survival of the game depends on the player preventing Adela from killing her. And even if she survives the nun's jealousy, what awaits her in the aqueduct is something she did not choose and cannot explain. The eyes of the first hunter. Gehrman's physical presentation deserves more attention than it usually receives. On the surface, he appears to be simply an elderly man confined to a wheelchair, with his worn black hat and tattered mantle and the peg leg that replaces his missing right foot. Those who have angled the camera inside his character model have noticed something unusual about his eyes. The irises appear crystallized, refracting light in an unusual way and lacking the conventional pupils of a normal human eye. This detail is not explained anywhere in the game's text. It is simply there, visible to anyone patient enough to look. What it might imply is open to reading. One possibility is that prolonged exposure to the moon presence and the lunar dream has altered him at a fundamental level, leaving a mark on his body that is legible, if only barely, in the light that catches the wrong way inside his eyes. The burial blade and the birth of a legacy. Gehrman is the inventor of trick weapons, the collapsing, transforming tools that define how combat feels in Bloodborne. His own weapon, the burial blade, is the originator of that entire design philosophy, a scythe that shortens into a curved sword, a weapon built on the principle that a hunter must be able to shift the shape of their violence as quickly as the situation demands. Item descriptions note that Gehrman was the first to conceive of such weapons, and the hunters who came after him carried on that tradition, each developing tools that folded and transformed in their own way. Everything from the saw cleaver to the hunter axe to the threaded cane traces its lineage back to the old man in the wheelchair, who decided that a single fixed blade was never going to be enough to survive what Yharnam was becoming. The voice behind the locked door. The real Iosefka is never seen. The woman you speak to through the locked door at the beginning of the game. Her voice careful and warm. Her concern for the hunter's safety genuine. Her insistence that she cannot open the door while the hunt is on honest and frightened rather than suspicious is the actual physician. She gives you a vial of her own blood that heals 70% of your total health as an act of pure generosity toward a stranger. The game's credits even note that the real Iosefka and the imposter who replaces her are voiced by different actresses. A technical confirmation of what attentive listeners likely suspected from the shift in tone that happens once Father Gascoigne has been defeated. The voice that changes. Return to Iosefka's door after killing Father Gascoigne and pay close attention. The voice on the other side of the door is subtly different. The warmth is still there in the phrasing, but it sits wrong, like a mask that almost fits. The imposter who has replaced Iosefka is not the same person, and while she has clearly studied Iosefka's manner of speaking, she cannot quite replicate the quality that made the original voice feel safe. She now asks you to send the survivors you encounter to the clinic. This is the first signal. A doctor who previously told you to keep anyone you find safe, to shelter them, to not bring them anywhere near the hunt, now wants you to actively route people to her door. The logic has inverted. The person behind it has inverted. The experiments behind the door. What is actually happening inside Iosefka's clinic during the second half of the game is one of Bloodborne's quietest atrocities. The survivors sent to the clinic are being transformed into celestial minions. Those pale, strangely graceful creatures that drift through later areas of the game. Through experiments the imposter is conducting in the name of ascending toward a higher form of being. The real Iosefka, by the time the player can access the clinic, has already been transformed herself, likely one of the first subjects. The imposter found a clinic conveniently staffed with someone who already had an established reputation for taking in survivors, and she used it. Everyone who trusted the kind voice behind the locked door paid for that trust in ways they could not have imagined. The Uden Writhe. There is a creature inside Iosefka's clinic, a celestial minion standing in the main hallway, with its hands folded in a gesture that reads as prayer. It is not hostile. It will not attack the player. If the player attacks it, it drops the Uden Writhe Carol rune, one of the game's more useful runes for aggressive play. What this creature is specifically is never stated. Its posture and placement, standing precisely where Iosefka would have stood, in the hallway where she once worked, carrying a rune associated with the entity that has claimed the clinic as its territory, could imply that this is what the real Iosefka became after the imposter replaced her. The game does not confirm this, but the combination of location, posture, and rune makes it one of the more quietly unsettling possibilities in the entire building. The hunter who couldn't stop. Gascoigne's tragedy is that he was exceptionally good at the hunt. Good enough that when the blood scourge began to tighten its grip, he kept going when others stopped. The line between sufficient hunting and compulsive hunting blurs quickly in Yharnam's logic. The blood itself seems to encourage escalation, to make the hunter feel that one more night of it will finally be enough. Gascoigne hunted past the point of safety. past the point where Viola could recognize her husband in the man who came back to their home. He began attacking the people of the city rather than the beasts. By the time the game begins, Viola has already gone out to find him and has already been killed by him, as the item describing her brooch eventually confirms, her blood on his hands in the most literal sense. He is not simply a man who became a beast. He is a man who became a beast and then killed his wife. The brooch in the lantern light. Viola's red jeweled brooch is the item that links the Gascoigne fight to the story of his daughters waiting at a window across the city. When the player retrieves it from her body in the graveyard and gives it to Gascoigne's older daughter, she recognizes it immediately and understands what it means. Her mother is dead. The moment is understated. The girl's response is quiet, and the item simply disappears from the inventory. But it is one of the game's most precise moments of emotional weight. A small red piece of jewelry carries an entire tragedy from one part of the city to another, and the player is the vehicle. You are the one who carries the news. You are the one who takes the brooch from the body and puts it into the child's hands. The Sky Burial and the Crow. Eileen the Crow is not a Yharnamite. Her attire, the crow feather set, and the crow hunter badge both explicitly note that she comes from a foreign land, a place where it is traditional to give the dead a sky burial rather than sealing them in coffins. This last detail matters to Eileen. She considers the Yharnam tradition of sealed coffins to be something close to blasphemous, a violation of how the dead should be treated. In a city increasingly populated by the risen dead, by beasts that were once people, by the unquiet echoes of a scourge that refuses to let anything stay properly buried, there is a dark irony in the fact that the woman assigned to be the city's executioner of the corrupted is also the one who cares most deeply about what happens to the bodies afterward. The questline that punishes inattention. Eileen's fate in the game is entirely determined by how carefully the player pays attention to where she is and when. If you speak to her in Central Yharnam or Cathedral Ward at the right moments, help her defeat Henrik at the Tomb of Uden, and intervene in her final battle at the Grand Cathedral, she survives. Or at least survives long enough to pass her covenant and her badge to you in thanks. If you miss her initial encounter entirely, she does not simply disappear from the story. She reappears at the Grand Cathedral after the defeat of Rom the Vacuous Spider as a hostile enemy. The woman who spent her career hunting hunters who had gone blood drunk has, in the version of the story where you ignored her, become one herself. It is a bleak loop, and it is entirely the result of not looking carefully enough, early enough. Hidden above the sewers. Eileen's first location is one of the game's better hidden NPC encounters. She is tucked into a passageway above the sewers in central Yharnam, accessible by breaking through a stack of crates in the large warehouse building near the sewer entrance. Most players miss her entirely on a first playthrough, which means they miss the beginning of her questline, which means she will eventually be standing at the Grand Cathedral, not as an ally, but as another corrupted hunter who needs to be put down. The very fate she spent her career preventing in others. The game does not announce her location. It does not point you toward the broken crates. You have to be curious, and you have to be thorough, and even then, you might walk right past. The hunter she hunts. The target that ultimately breaks Eileen, the one that wounds her so badly she can barely stand at the cathedral steps, is the Bloody Crow of Canehurst. This unnamed hunter is one of the most dangerous human enemies in the entire game, fast and aggressive and armed with a Chicago that he favors in a two-handed form that slowly drains his own health. He represents everything Eileen has spent her career fighting. A hunter so far gone into bloodlust that he cannot be talked back. He is her final quarry, and he is too much for her. The player who finds Eileen slumped and wounded outside the cathedral, and then goes inside to face the bloody crow, on her behalf is performing exactly the kind of act of solidarity that the game quietly prizes above most others. Not a grand gesture, but a practical one, done because someone who deserved better ran out of road. The only kindness in Yharnam. The lore around the plain doll makes a specific claim that is easy to miss in the flow of the game. She is the only NPC in all of Bloodborne described as taking a genuinely kind and loving stance toward hunters. Not merely neutral, not merely functional, loving. Every other NPC either wants something from you, is spiraling toward a dark end, or is already there. The doll simply cares. She asks about the hunt not to assess your usefulness, but out of something that functions, whatever its origin, as a real concern. The doll's set description says her attire was made with great love that borders on mania and exudes slight warmth, which tells you something both about how Gehrman felt when he made her, and about how the warmth he intended, however broken its origins, passed into the thing he created. She was built from obsession, but what she became is something gentler. The inanimate weight. When the player kills Lady Maria in the astral clock tower and then returns to the hunter's dream and speaks with the doll, she says something unexpected. She tells the hunter that she feels lighter somehow, that a weight has been lifted. This is confirmed dialogue. What exactly that weight was is something the game leaves open. One reading is that the doll, built in Maria's likeness, carried something of the original's unresolved grief embedded in her very construction, and that Maria's release from the nightmare freed something in the copy as well. Another is simply that the doll felt the connection to Maria as a presence she did not fully understand, and its absence registered as relief. Neither reading is wrong. The doll herself doesn't claim to understand it. She only knows she feels lighter, and for a character who exists in permanent service and has no will of her own, that small change is everything. The first sight of the doll. When you enter the hunter's dream for the first time, the plain doll is lying in a heap of her own clothing near the entrance, motionless, face down. She is just an object at that point, porcelain and fabric, beautifully crafted, obviously someone's precious work, but inert. She only comes to life when the player accumulates 1 point of insight, that strange currency the game uses to measure your growing awareness of the true nature of the world. The metaphor is direct. You have to see more before she becomes visible. You have to begin to understand the nightmare before the thing that guides you through it can reach back. If your insight drops to 0 again, she returns to her collapsed state, once more just a doll on the floor of a dream, waiting for you to understand enough to wake her. The ornament in the cupboard, in the abandoned old workshop, that echo of Gehrman's original workspace, buried in the real Yharnam. There is a small hair ornament, sitting in a cupboard. The item description connects it directly to the plain doll, noting that the attire worn by the doll was made with love bordering on mania, and that this ornament was kept alongside it. Given that the doll was made in Maria's likeness, the most natural reading is that this ornament belonged to Maria herself, a private keepsake that Gehrman preserved when the real woman was gone. He made a copy of Maria for the dream and, it seems, kept a fragment of the original in the waking world, as if the smallest remnant of her was worth preserving even in a place he could no longer reach. Finding it feels intrusive in the best way, the way the game's best environmental storytelling always does. The Lumenflower Bridge. The plain doll carries lumenflower motifs woven into her clothing and a lumenflower brooch at her collar. The doll was made in Lady Maria's exact likeness, her attire crafted to mirror the real woman in every detail Gehrman could reproduce. That the doll wears lumenflower imagery could imply that Maria herself had an affection for the flower. And the research hall where Maria worked is indeed filled with them, glowing pale and blue in the Nightmare Garden. Whether this was a deliberate detail placed by Gehrman in the doll's making, or simply the attire he remembered her wearing, the flower appears in both women as a thread connecting them. The plain doll in the dream and the sleeping knight in the astral clock tower are, in the deepest sense, the same woman seen through two different kinds of longing. And the lumen flower, subtle as it is part of what makes that visible. The death that mirrors the teacher. Watch carefully when Lady Maria dies at the end of her boss fight. The animation of her defeat, the specific way her body falls, the final gesture, is closely mirrored by Gehrman's own death animation. This is another quiet connection, a visual rhyme between student and teacher that the game plants without announcement. They trained together, they shaped each other, and in the end, when both of them finally stop moving, they stop moving in the same way. It is a detail that asks to be noticed rather than explained, the kind of thing from software encodes in the geometry of motion precisely because words would make it too obvious and too small. The accent that marks her origin. Unlike the overwhelming majority of named characters in Bloodborne, who speak with English accents of various registers, Lady Maria speaks with a Slavic accent. So does the plain doll, for reasons already explored. Maria is from Cainhurst, and Cainhurst's aesthetic, the castle architecture, the pale aristocratic faces, the cold northern geography, draws from Eastern and Central European Gothic traditions. The accent is one of the ways the game signals her difference, her foreignness within the world of Yharnam, even before her backstory is understood. She sounds like she comes from somewhere else because she does. The patients who loved her. In the research hall of the Astral Clock Tower, the deformed patients who wander the area, grotesquely transformed by the Healing Church's experiments, enlarged heads splitting under their own accumulated fluid, hold Lady Maria in something close to reverence. St. Adeline, one of the hall's patients, mistakes the player for Maria on first encounter, suggesting Maria was a regular presence there. Whether her compassion was genuine or simply the professional manner of someone managing research subjects is something the game leaves deliberately open. But based on how Adeline responds, and on the general disposition of the patients toward the clock tower above them, it appears she treated them with a care that was unusual enough to be remembered. Even broken, even barely recognizable as the people they once were, they remember who was gentle. The noble dress and the tarnished silver. The specific description of Ariana's appearance is worth examining alongside the Cainhurst connection. Cainhurst nobility are consistently depicted with silver or grey-white colouring, the visual marker of their bloodline. Ariana's hair has a tarnished, lightened quality that could be read as a diluted version of that same silver, the way an inherited trait fades across generations without disappearing. The dress, meanwhile, clearly survived long after its origin. She wears something that speaks of aristocratic inheritance while she lives in an alley. Whatever Cainhurst was, this reading suggests it persists in her whether she claims it or not, carried forward in her blood and her clothing by people who may not have known what they were passing down. The blood that isn't sacred. Adela's willingness to kill Ariana hinges on a specific threshold. After the player has accepted 3 vials of Ariana's blood in Adela's presence, something shifts in Adela. Some combination of religious conviction and personal jealousy, and the particular madness that the blood-soaked nights of Yharnam accelerate in anyone already inclined toward obsession. She kills Ariana. The game frames this partly in terms of the Healing Church's ideology. Ariana's blood is tainted, a forbidden category, and accepting it over the sanctioned blood of a nun represents a kind of apostasy. But the way Adela watches, and the way the violence arrives when the watching finally tips into action, suggests something more personal than doctrine. She has decided that Ariana should not be preferred. The theological justification is available, but the emotional engine is jealousy. The church dress that calms her. Finding Adela in the first place requires more than simply walking up to her. She's being held by snatchers when the player first locates her, and approaching her directly while dressed in ordinary hunting gear will result in her remaining defensive and closed off. The player must be wearing a piece of Healing Church attire. The White Church set, the Black Church set, Gascoigne's set, or the Executioner garb. Before Adela will settle, recognize the player as someone associated with the organization she serves, and consent to follow. This detail is quietly rich. Adela's entire sense of safety and trust is institutional. The church is the thing that makes the world make sense to her, and a person wearing church clothing is a person the world has authorized. Take away the clothing, or rather never present it, and she is just a frightened woman who has no way to evaluate whether you are safe. The blood that heals more. One practical dimension of Adela that is worth noting: her blood vials, when accepted, heal more than standard blood vials and continue healing over a short period after use. Ariana's blood does something similar. Both women's blood carries specific properties that distinguish it from the generic blood currency that hunters use to survive. The practical effect is that both women are offering the player something rare and personal at real cost to themselves. In Ariana's case, the cost eventually becomes total. In Adela's case, the cost is the version of herself she might have been if the blood moon had not found her already compromised. The shoes at the clinic. There is a subtle, easily missed detail that exists for players who send Ariana to Yosefka's clinic rather than the chapel. Ariana's shoes. The same shoes she is wearing in her alley in the cathedral ward, eventually turn up inside the clinic as a droppable item. What this means precisely is left open. It could mean that she found her way there later, seeking some other kind of shelter. It could mean something worse happened. The game places the shoes where anyone looking carefully enough will find them, and leaves the interpretation entirely to the player's imagination. In the context of everything else happening at that clinic, the shoes sitting unclaimed in a room of transformed strangers land with a particular weight. The umbilical cord she carries. If Ariana survives long enough to deliver her child in the aqueduct, killing the infant yields one of the game's 4 third umbilical cord items, the 3 of which are needed to access the true final ending and the fight with the moon presence. This connects Ariana's entire arc: the Canehurst bloodline, the tainted blood, the night in the aqueduct, directly to the game's cosmological endgame. She was not incidental to the story. Her body was, from the moment the red moon appeared, a site of cosmic significance. The game does not tell her this. She does not know this. She simply finds herself in an aqueduct, in pain, with something that is not quite her child, while the hunter she sheltered once passes through on their way to meet a god. Alfred and the legacy he could not outrun. Alfred is found in Cathedral Ward, just past the room that leads toward Old Yarnum, offering fire paper and a prayer gesture to any hunter willing to cooperate with his mission. He identifies himself as an executioner, a member of the Healing Church's enforcement arm, the group that obliterated the Vile Blood faction at Canehurst under the leadership of Martyr Logarius, Logar E. Us. His master is dead. The executioners as an organization are effectively defunct, but Alfred is still executing. He has absorbed Logarius's mission so completely that his identity is inseparable from it. The Vile Bloods must be destroyed. The bloodline must be ended, and Alfred will be the one to end it, even if he has to do it alone, even if there is only one Vile Blood left, even if that Vile Blood is an effectively immortal queen sitting in a hidden throne room behind an illusory wall. The gift that sealed her fate. In the Vile Blood Queen's chamber, on a table within easy reach of the throne where Annalise sits, there is an unopened summons, a letter addressed to Alfred that grants him access to the castle. The player can pick it up and deliver it to him. Doing so is technically optional. The Wheel Hunter Badge. Alfred gives in thanks is a useful reward, but the moment you hand Alfred that letter, you have set events in motion that cannot be stopped. Alfred leaves immediately for Canehurst. The next time the player arrives in the throne room, they find Annalise's body torn apart and Alfred standing over it, his hands covered in blood, speaking in the fragmented syntax of a man who has crossed a line he cannot see anymore. He has done the thing his entire life was built to do, and having done it, he does not know what he is. The queen who cannot permanently die, Annalise, Queen of the Vile Bloods, is introduced not through a battle or a dramatic encounter, but through a locked door and a crown. To reach her, the player must defeat Martyr Logarius atop his seat at Canehurst Castle, take the crown of illusions from his body, equip it, and approach his throne. At which point, an illusory wall dissolves to reveal the hidden wing, where Annalise has sat for an indeterminate amount of time, preserved in a state that is neither quite alive nor quite dead. She is the last Vile Blood. Logarius himself stayed behind as a self-appointed warden, maintaining the seal around her prison and keeping anyone from reaching the last remnant of the lineage he had dedicated his life to destroying. Whether he stayed out of lingering devotion, out of fear that killing her outright would do something worse, or out of a complicated entrapment he could not articulate, the game does not say. He is simply there, enormous and sorrowful, and she is simply preserved inside. The inspiration behind the Queen. Annalise's design draws heavily from the historical figure of Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman of the 16th and 17th centuries, considered by some historians to be among the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, accused of killing hundreds of young women and allegedly bathing in their blood in the belief that it would preserve her youth. Annalise, an immortal queen in an isolated northern castle, sustained by blood, surrounded by the remnants of aristocratic excess, maps directly onto that legendary template. Even the cold and isolated geography of Canehurst, covered in snow, recalls the Carpathian mountain settings associated with Eastern European vampire mythology. The revival at the altar. What makes Annalise's mortality interesting is that it is reversible. If Alfred kills her and the player collects the queenly flesh from the throne, that flesh can be taken to the altar of despair in the upper cathedral ward. After defeating Ebrietas, Ebri Ioiti Az, daughter of the cosmos, and Annalise can be revived. She returns to her throne as though nothing happened. She does not comment on having been killed. She does not acknowledge Alfred or the player's role in what occurred. She simply resumes being queen, because the thing that Annalise is cannot be ended by a man in armor with a purpose. The Healing Church could not kill her permanently. The executioners could not. Alfred could not. She sits in her throne at the end of whatever happens because she has always sat in her throne at the end of whatever happens. The mercy that never stopped. Every time you arrive at the hunter's dream and speak with Gehrman, he offers guidance and gentle wisdom. What is easy to forget is that this offer of guidance is not a performance put on for one particular hunter. Gehrman has done this for every hunter who has ever passed through the dream, an uncountable number of them across an indeterminate span of time. He has watched hunters arrive, learn, go out into the nightmare, and not come back. He has offered the same quiet mercy to each one. Rest here, take what you need. Let me help you find the path. The burial blade at the end of the game is his final gift to the hunters he serves. A clean death, a release from the dream, the only freedom he can offer when he cannot free himself. The smoke and the return. Here is a detail that many players who attacked Gehrman in the hunter's dream never expected. Striking him before the appointed confrontation at the end of the game does not kill him. He cannot be killed that way. Instead, he disappears into a cloud of smoke and reappears the next time you enter the dream, as composed and unhurried as ever. It is one of the quieter illustrations of what Gehrman truly is. Not a mortal man aging in a mortal dream, but something the moon presence has claimed and preserved and made effectively unkillable by any means that does not respect the terms of the contract. He belongs to the dream. The dream will not let him go. The workshop that shaped the world. There is a real workshop in the waking city of Yharnam, tucked away in the area called the Abandoned Old Workshop, that precedes the one in the hunter's dream. It is Gehrman's original space, the physical location where he first trained hunters, where he first developed the tools and techniques that would define the hunt. When the Healing Church eventually consolidated power and established its own workshop, Gehrman's original operation was effectively absorbed and then made obsolete. The dream version of that workshop is the echo of the original. The same layout, the same bones, but existing now only within a space that Gehrman's mind maintains. Walking through the abandoned old workshop in the waking world, and then returning to the hunter's dream, is one of those quiet moments where the game lets the two realities sit next to each other without comment, and the comparison says more than any cutscene could. The contract and its cost. The third umbilical cord item contains one of the game's most direct pieces of cosmological information. The hunter's dream was brought into being by the child of a great one, whose arrival precipitated the encounter with the pale moon. This connects Gehrman's creation of the dream not simply to his own grief and longing, but to the active involvement of cosmic entities steering events in Yharnam toward an outcome they desired. What looks like a sanctuary from the outside is, from the perspective of the entity overseeing it, closer to a farm, a place where something the Great Ones value is cultivated and harvested, generation after generation, while the man who agreed to tend it sits in his chair and watches the flowers grow. The lie he tells with kindness. One of the most quietly devastating things about Gehrman is the gap between his presented self and what his sleeping murmurs reveal. During waking interaction, he is warm, measured, and grandfatherly. He seems almost at peace with his situation. He calls you the new hunter with something approaching genuine affection. None of that warmth is false, but it is incomplete. The version of Gehrman, who talks in his sleep, who screams at men long dead to come and save him, who has been tending this prison garden for longer than any human life should extend. That version also exists. He has learned, over what may be centuries, to wear his composure like a set of armor. The kindness is real. The suffering underneath the kindness is also real. And the game gives you both, if you look closely enough. The younger daughter's fate. Gascoigne's younger daughter, the one who gives the player the music box and asks them to find her parents, can be sent to the cathedral ward for safety, or to Iosefka's clinic. If she is sent to the clinic, her story ends there, absorbed into the imposter's experiments. If she is not sent anywhere, she eventually stops responding at the window, replaced by a note about not being well, then silence, then eventually the small discovery that a giant pig in the sewers below has swallowed something that belonged to her. The game does not show you what happened. It does not narrate it. It simply allows you, if you are paying attention, to piece it together from the items and the absence. The way a city that has completely fallen apart treats the people small enough to be overlooked. The incense that holds the dark back. Udon Chapel has a guardian that most players never fully appreciate. The chapel dweller, the misshapen, unsettling figure who hunches near the entrance and insists on directing every survivor toward the relative safety of the church, burns incense. That incense is not decorative. In Bloodborne's world, the smell of burning incense actively repels beasts, keeping the chapel interior safe even as the city outside descends into chaos. The chapel dweller has been maintaining this barrier quietly and without recognition throughout the entire night of the hunt. When the suspicious beggar is sent to the chapel and his true nature eventually reveals itself, he is found waiting outside, not inside. Specifically because the incense prevents him from entering. He does his killing from beyond the threshold. The one thing standing between every survivor in that chapel and a beast in disguise is an act of sustained, unacknowledged devotion by the creature everyone assumed was just furniture. The formless one in the chapel. There is a theory connecting the Udon Chapel dweller more directly to the Great One Udon than his simple surface role suggests. He drops a formless Udon rune when killed. He wears an incense urn like a necklace. He appears to be blind, navigating entirely by scent, which is how he mistook the player for a beast on their first meeting. Some lore readers have proposed that the chapel dweller is not simply a caretaker of Udon's tomb, but is in some capacity a servant or vessel of the formless Great One himself. That his insistence on gathering people to the chapel may serve Udon's interests in ways neither the dweller nor the survivors he collects can fully perceive. Whether this reading is correct, the game declines to say. But the rune he carries and the blindness that orients him by smell rather than sight give the theory more texture than most. The warden on the tower, Jura, is first encountered not as a character, but as a problem. A relentless spray of bullets from a Gatling gun mounted in a tower above Oldiharnum, cutting down the player as they try to navigate the ruins below. His name, in Swedish, means animal. Oldiharnum was the site of one of the Healing Church's great purges, a systematic burning of an entire district after the beasthood growing in its population exceeded the church's ability to manage it quietly. The people who survived the fire are the beasts that now wander the ruins. Jura knows this. He was there during the hunts, or close enough to them to understand exactly what the creatures below him once were. At some point, he decided he would not participate in finishing what the church started, took up position in the tower, and has been there since. The revelation that retired him. Jura was once a hunter with real standing, described in the Future Press game guide as having been both uncommonly kind and dreadfully foolish during his active days. Two qualities that are probably connected. The kindness made him pay attention to what he was actually doing. The foolishness made him act on what he noticed. His dialogue confirms that, like Eileen, he no longer dreams, implying that at some point he was released from the hunter's dream, the same mercy Gehrman is described as offering hunters who reach the end of the hunt. Rather than returning to the city afterward, he chose to remain in Old Ihanam. He stations himself between the beasts and the hunters who still want to hunt them, armed with a Gatling gun and a conviction that makes him one of the most dangerous NPCs the player will encounter if they push into his territory without understanding what he is protecting. The name that means something. Jura had 3 companions across his hunting career, referenced in item descriptions and NPC placements throughout the game. One of them, known in the Future Press guide as Jura's ally, can be found at the base of Jura's tower, non-hostile toward the beasts and aggressively hostile toward the player. The ally wears the charred hunter set, attire specifically described as worn by hunters who were present during the burning of Old Ihanam. This means at least one of Jura's companions was there for the fire, participated in the purge, and then also changed their position afterward. A second companion appears in the hunter's nightmare, fully consumed by blood-drunk madness. Whatever they went through together, they ended up in 3 very different places. The eyes he lost, the Master's iron helm, the distinctive headgear Volta wears throughout the game, has a piece of lore attached to it that reframes his final appearance entirely. Its description states that Volta has long since lost the ability to see vermin. The very gift that defined his purpose, the perception that made everything make sense, has faded. He can no longer see the thing he built an entire organization to destroy. This is why he passes leadership to the player when 5 vermin have been crushed. Not as a ceremonial retirement gift, but as a genuine transfer of purpose to someone who can still do what he cannot. He leaves behind the Iron Helm, disappears from the Forbidden Woods, and is never seen again. What becomes of a man whose entire identity was built around perceiving something he can no longer perceive is left entirely to the imagination. The revenge that made a monster. There is something quietly disturbing in the sequence of events that produced Valter. He went into Yharnam a constable, someone whose purpose was the enforcement of rules, the protection of order, the application of measured force within defined limits. He came out the Beast Eater, a man who had consumed a monster whole, and in doing so acquired a form of vision that ordinary people can't access. The league he built is earnest and well-intentioned, its mission one of the more plainly stated goods in a game full of ambiguous ones. But Valter got there by doing something that the game's own logic would classify as beastly. He ate a beast and became something more than human. The line he thought he was protecting collapsed the moment he crossed it to protect it. The man who came to ask questions. Simon the Harrowed is one of Bloodborne's most purposeful guides, a hunter of the Healing Church who managed to enter the hunter's nightmare while retaining his sanity, something almost no one else managed to do. He came because he knew the church had secrets it was not sharing, and he believed those secrets were connected to the suffering he had witnessed. His first words to the player, found in the nightmare's opening corridor, are almost wistful. You seek nightmares, and the secrets within, do you not? it is the recognition of a fellow traveller, someone who came for the same reason and knows the going will be difficult. He guides the player forward through the DLC with an honesty that is unusual in this world, pointing toward Lady Maria and the secrets behind the clock tower, leading the investigation that Brador will ultimately try to silence. The bowblade he carried. Simon's weapon, the bowblade, is unique in Bloodborne's arsenal. In its normal form, a curved scimitar quick enough for close combat. Transformed, it becomes a great bow, trading speed for devastating reach. The weapon reflects Simon's character, a man who is both an insider and an outsider, who can engage directly when necessary, but prefers to maintain a certain investigative distance from the worst of what he is examining. His method was right. He simply could not outrun the man the church sent to enforce its silence. Finding him near the lighthouse hut, mortally wounded, having come so close to the truth he was seeking, carries a specific weight. He tells the player to finish what he started, gives them the key to Brador's cell, and stops being there. The bell that only kills, Brador, invades the player's world 4 consecutive times in the fishing hamlet, dropping a piece of his attire with each defeat. But Brador himself, in the physical world, is not out there hunting. He is in a cell, sitting in the dark, ringing a bell that makes no sound. The church gave him this specific bell to summon phantom versions of himself into the worlds of hunters who drew too close to things that needed to stay hidden. He does not have to move. He does not have to travel. He rings the bell, and versions of him materialize to kill whatever needs killing, and he goes back to sitting in the dark. The cell key description says that hunters are placed in the underground cell, so that things better left unseen will decay quietly in the fallow darkness. Brador is one of those things. He was given a function that required his continued existence and a location where no one would look. The foreshadowing in the attire. Yamamura's clothing carries an echo into the future of From Software's catalogue. His layered robes and the distinctive silhouette of an Eastern warrior closely resemble the outfit worn by the wolf in Sekiro. Shadows Die Twice, the studio's subsequent release. Whether this was deliberate design foreshadowing or coincidental alignment, it points to a through line in how From Software thinks about a certain kind of figure. A foreigner from the East, out of place in a Western nightmare, carrying a blade and a grief that drives him further than wisdom recommends. Yamamura arrived in Yharnam from somewhere across a significant distance, was broken by what he found, and left a silhouette behind that the studio would continue developing. The Patches who was never fully human. Patches is the most reliably treacherous recurring character in From Software's catalogue, and Bloodborne makes the most honest statement yet about what he probably always was. In this game, he is a spider. Not metaphorically, but literally. A creature with a human head and torso above multiple arachnid legs. The game does not explain when or how he arrived at this form. He is a servant of Amygdala, and everything he does, the warm greeting, the tonsil stone offered with the language of helpfulness, the trail of shining coins in the nightmare frontier, is in service of feeding hunters to his patron. He has been in every From Software game before this one, always friendly and always treacherous, and always occupying the specific role of the person who seems to be helping until the moment they push you off something. The apology that changes nothing. After Amygdala is defeated and the player confronts Patches face to face in the upper lecture hall, he does what every version of Patches always eventually does. Begs forgiveness. He's practically mortified. He acknowledges that what he did was wrong. He has clearly practiced this speech. because some version of it is always available when he reaches this stage with a hunter. In exchange for not being killed, he gives the player the anti-clockwise metamorphosis rune and the beg for life gesture. He also eventually appears as a merchant in Chalice dungeons, charging extortionate prices for his goods. Whether the apology is sincere is a question the game would not answer honestly, even if it tried. What is certain is that it changes nothing about what he is, or what he will do in the next game, or the one after that. The flame sprayer. He never used. When Gilbert decides the end is close enough that he will not need his possessions anymore, he gives the player his flame sprayer, a weapon useful against beasts, the kind of thing a man sheltering through a hunt would keep close. He notes with something almost apologetic in his tone that he made no use of it himself. The lore implication is that he received the flame sprayer from a church blood minister when he first arrived seeking treatment, that it was the thing they gave him to protect himself with if things went wrong. He kept it, he never fired it. Maintaining that distinction all the way to the end is its own quiet statement about the person Gilbert was. Someone who came to Yharnam to be healed, not to fight, who held that original intention even as the city around him turned everything into combat. The scholar who stopped speaking, Master Willem, is found at Bergenwerthen College, seated in a rocking chair on the lunarium, overlooking the moonlit lake where Rom sleeps. He is the founder of the academic institution from which the healing church grew, the man who believed true ascension came through the accumulation of eyes, literal internal eyes, rather than through the blood Lawrence chose. By the time the player arrives, Willem can no longer speak. He can only point. Strange growths have developed on his back, coral-like and tubular, suggesting he achieved some partial version of what he spent his life working toward. He simply cannot report on what it was like to get there. He points at the lake and the spider sleeping beneath it, directing the player toward the next step in a plan that has been waiting for someone capable of executing it. The last scholar's defense. When the player reaches Bergenwerth, Willem is guarded by Yuri, identified in the credits as Yuri, the last scholar. She is a healing church scholar who attacks on sight, armed with arcane tools and willing to die defending the man sitting in the rocking chair. She is the only person left at Bergenwerth. Whatever staff or student body the college once had, whatever community of scholars gathered there before the schism with Lawrence and the establishment of the church, has been reduced to this: one woman with a weapon, standing between an old man who can no longer speak and everything that wants to reach him. Her loyalty is unexplained by any quest or dialogue. She is simply there, the last one, doing what the last scholar in a place like that does. The partnership description that says everything. Item descriptions in Bloodborne are often dense with implication, but the air rune that Henrik drops is worth reading carefully. It describes blood echoes gained through visceral attacks, the act of one fighter responding to the opening created by another's stagger, and connects this to the specific kind of relationship that existed between Henrik and Gascoigne. Their partnership was the kind where each man made the other more effective, where the gap created by one was filled by the other, where the victory of the pair was built from the contributions of both. The air rune exists because of that partnership. When Gascoigne died, the rune stayed, because what was built between them does not simply disappear when one of the builders does. The Bloody Crow's unknown name, the Bloody Crow of Canehurst, the hunter who wounds Eileen so grievously outside the Grand Cathedral and awaits the player inside, has no name in the game's official documentation. He is a hostile hunter wearing Canehurst attire, wielding a chikage he favors in two-handed form at the cost of his own health, and he is among the most dangerous human enemies the entire game presents. His identity is left deliberately blank. He is a vile blood hunter, presumably connected to Annalise's covenant, and he has gone so deep into bloodlust that he attacks on sight and fights with no apparent self-preservation instinct. He is Eileen's final target and her undoing, the one she could not finish alone. He represents, in entirely concrete terms, exactly what the Hunter of Hunters covenant exists to stop. The Triumph Gesture. The Oedon Chapel Dweller teaches the player the Triumph Gesture, a raised fist celebration, after the first survivor has been successfully sent to the chapel. It is a small gesture, and it is the only celebration in the game that is given freely, without irony, without a cost, without a twist in the quest line ahead. He is just happy that someone came. He expresses this happiness with a raised fist. In a game where almost every warm moment is complicated by what surrounds it, the Dweller's triumph is notable for being exactly what it appears to be. One creature genuinely pleased that another creature showed up. The skeptic who survived through stubbornness. The skeptical man's survival through the blood. Moonphase, the only NPC who does not break psychologically, has a second-order implication worth sitting with. The Blood Moon's revelation is devastating precisely because it forces perception. It strips away the veil that kept the true nature of the city hidden, and everyone who sees clearly enough is broken by the clarity. The skeptical man survives because he refuses to see clearly. His narrowness, his dismissiveness, his insistence that the things around him are not as bad as everyone claims, these qualities, which make him irritating throughout the game, function as a form of protection when the world proves too terrible to perceive directly. He lives because he will not look. The lonely old woman's sedatives. The lonely old woman, for all her grumbling and her initial hostility toward the player, has a progression in her quest line that most players miss. As more bosses are defeated and the night advances, she warms incrementally. She begins offering the player free sedatives, items that counter the frenzy status effect, even going out to find more when asked. This is not nothing. Sedatives are useful. The effort of procuring them represents real care expressed through the only means available to an old woman in a collapsing city, practical provision. She does not have weapons to offer or lore to share. She has sedatives and the willingness to go find them. The grumbling never entirely stops, but the action underneath it is reliable. The older daughter's silence. Gascoigne's older daughter is one of those NPCs whose questline ends without announcement. If the player gives her Viola's red jeweled brooch, she understands what it means, goes quiet, and the interaction is complete. She does not appear again. She does not have a cutscene. There is no resolution given to her storyline, no confirmation of what became of her, no scene of her leaving or staying or being found. The game simply allows her to become one of the silences that Yharnam is full of. A person whose story reached a certain point and then stopped being told, the way real lives stop being told, not with conclusion, but with absence. The tonsil stone and the trap. The tonsil stone that Patches gives the player is described as a latticed gravel-like stone that, when held, reveals the presence of a lesser amygdala concealed near the entrance to Yahar'gul. The implication of the description, that this is something grand waiting to be discovered, is technically accurate. What it omits is that the amygdala will grab the player and transport them involuntarily to the lecture building. the first step in a sequence that ends with Patches pushing the player off a cliff. The tonsil stone is both a useful item and a lure. It provides real access to a new area and is required for certain quest progressions. Patches understood that the best traps are the ones that are not entirely false. The chapel's amygdala. There is a lesser amygdala clinging to the exterior wall of Uden Chapel that the player cannot see without insight. With enough insight, it becomes visible. An enormous, multi-limbed entity pressed against the building, watching the survivors inside. The chapel was presumably chosen by the chapel dweller partly because of the incense, but there is a darker reading available. Whatever draws the amygdala to that wall may be the same thing that makes the chapel a place of convergence throughout the game. The formless Great One Odin has his tomb directly above the area. The amygdala outside the chapel may not be a threat so much as a presence, something drawn to the intersection of surviving human life and cosmic attention that the Odin Chapel represents. The Adeline who heard a sound. Saint Adeline, found shackled in the research hall with her head grotesquely enlarged from the church's experiments, is listening. This is her primary activity and her primary identity. She hears a sound that other patients cannot perceive, something that emanates from deeper within the water, from the nightmare-adjacent territories that the research hall's experiments were designed to approach. She asks the player for brain fluid, not out of hunger or madness, but as a tool. Each dose of the fluid allows her to hear the sound more clearly, to push toward a perception she believes is important. The milkweed rune that her perception eventually produces, describing those who brand themselves with it as lumenwoods that peer toward the sky, feeding phantasms, is Adeline's final gift to the world she was born into. It cost her life to envision it. She considered that a fair exchange. The mistake she made that named them. Adeline's first words when the player approaches her are, "Is that you, Lady Maria?" The mistake is everything. She immediately corrects herself. "No, you're someone else." But the initial misidentification tells the player that Maria was not only present in this hall, but was present often enough and kindly enough that her arrival was something these patients anticipated and hoped for. The research hall was a place of terrible experimentation, and the patients in it were its subjects. Maria's presence there, whatever her role in the experiments themselves, created something in at least one of those patients that reads as attachment, as hope, as the specific kind of memory that survives even when most memory has been overwritten by suffering. The blood dreg economy, the mechanic of Annalise's covenant, reveals the scale of her actual project. Blood dregs, the offering currency obtained by killing other hunters, must be brought to her in the throne room. She is collecting them toward a goal her covenant description makes explicit: to one day bear a child to Odin, the formless Great One. The Vile Bloods were not simply aristocrats with forbidden tastes. They were, in their own understanding, working toward a cosmological outcome. The executioners interrupted this project. Martyr Logarius died, containing the last participant. Alfred killed that participant on behalf of a dead man's mission. And Annalise, once revived, returns to the throne and resumes. The project continues at whatever pace it has always continued, in the hidden room behind the illusion, as slowly and as certainly as it always has. The Mensis cage and what it opened. The Mensis cage, worn by Mikolash, is not simply a piece of metal. It is a device designed to trap and concentrate the thoughts of its wearer, creating a signal strong enough to be perceived by entities that do not ordinarily attend to human cognition. The school of Mensis put these on their scholars and waited. Most of them became the hollow, stumbling figures encountered throughout the nightmare of Mensis. People for whom the connection was established, but who were not equipped to survive it. Mikolash survived it, after a fashion. He is still running around quoting prayers and gesturing at the sky. He's the school's most successful outcome, and its most complete cautionary tale simultaneously. The Henrik set available. After his death. After Henrik is killed, his distinctive Henrik's Hunter set becomes available for purchase at the Insight Bath Messenger in the Hunter's Dream. This is a standard from software design convention, but its logic within the game's world is worth noting. Henrik was, once, one of the great hunters. His attire was famous enough to be meaningful. The messengers, those strange small creatures who run the dream shops, recognize this and make it accessible to anyone willing to spend the currency of accumulated horror. You can wear what Gascoigne's old partner wore. You can carry the aesthetic of a man who outlived his purpose and could not find a new one. Whether that is tribute or appropriation is a distinction the dream does not make. The Mikolash exit line. When Mikolash is defeated, his final words are, "Now I'm waking up, I'll forget everything." This line collapses the entire horror of his situation into a single sentence. He was not experiencing the nightmare as a trap or a punishment. He was experiencing it as an ongoing state of consciousness, a place of permanent revelation, where Kors might hear his prayers, where the great ones were neighbors rather than distant things. Waking up is the bad outcome. Forgetting is the loss. He was the host of the nightmare not because something was done to him, but because he chose to stay, and his defeat is, from his perspective, the termination of the most important project of his life. Now I'm waking up is not relief. It is mourning. The abandoned workshop's echo. The abandoned old workshop, accessible only by rolling off a descending elevator at a precise moment, is the physical world echo of the Hunter's Dream workshop. The same basic layout, the same bones. An inanimate version of the doll lies there. A small hair ornament sits in the cupboard. And given that the doll was made in Maria's likeness, this strongly suggests it was kept as a memorial to her. The doll set can be found there, confirming what is already strongly implied. This is the place Gehrman's mind reached for when it built the dream. He was not imagining an idealized workshop. He was reconstructing the specific one he knew, the one where he trained hunters before the church made it obsolete. Visiting both spaces, the waking workshop silent and dust-covered, the dream workshop alive and occupied, creates an understanding of Gehrman's interior life that no explicit narration could replicate. The doll who gains a name. The plain doll has no name beyond her description. She is simply the doll, a common noun treated as a proper one. The game's way of saying that what she is defines her more completely than who she might be. But her set description identifies her as made with love that borders on mania. She was made to be specific. She was made to be a specific person. The name she was given was never Maria's. Maria was not a doll and would not have wanted to be called one. The doll's namelessness is the gap between the original and the copy. She has everything about Maria's appearance and nothing of her name, because the name belonged to a person Gehrman could not recreate, and calling the approximation by that name would have made the failure of the approximation impossible to ignore. The 4 umbilical cords, 3 of the 4 third umbilical cord items in the game, are connected directly to NPCs. 1 from Ariana's newborn child, 1 from killing the imposter Iosefka before the blood moon, and 1 from a specific location in the nightmare of Mensis. a fourth exists in the abandoned old workshop. The lore around these items connects them to the moon presence and to a cosmological event. The game calls the child of a great one, precipitating the encounter with the pale moon. 3 of the 4 most direct pathways to the game's true ending run through the stories of women the Healing Church's world consumed. A descendant of Canehurst in an aqueduct, a physician whose identity was stolen, a scholar conducting experiments in a locked clinic. The architecture of the true ending is built on their suffering. The Healing Church's original sin, the full picture that the NPCs collectively assemble, is of an institution that built its public legitimacy on one service: blood ministration, the healing of illness, while pursuing a private agenda that treated its patients as research subjects, its hunters as expendable tools, and its secrets as things worth murder to maintain. Alfred gave his life to a mission he inherited rather than chose. Brador gave his freedom to a task the Church assigned him for its own protection. The research hall patients gave whatever they had left to experiments they did not consent to. Yamamura gave his sanity to an oath that looked through him rather than at him. The chapel dweller gave his entire existence to keeping people safe in a building named for the entity that was consuming them from above. None of them were told the full truth about what they were part of. The hunt's most honest mirror. Father Gascoigne is, in the first moments of the game, both an ally and a warning. He can be summoned to help with the cleric beast fight, a powerful phantom who will tear through the boss alongside the player. And then he is the next boss, the first major one, a man transformed and hunted in the same graveyard where his wife's body lies. He is the game's first complete statement about what the hunt does over time. It takes the most capable and the most committed, and it uses them up. And the thing it leaves behind is dangerous in a way that the person was not. Dangerous without purpose. Dangerous because the skill remains after the meaning has been consumed. He is the warning the game places at its own beginning, visible to anyone who is ready to read it, and invisible to anyone who is not. The night that never fully ends. Eileen tells the player at the Grand Cathedral that she no longer dreams, that death, for her now, is permanent. What she is describing is the completion of a process. At some point in her long career, she was severed from the dream, the same release Gehrman is described as offering hunters. Whether she requested it deliberately or it came at the end of a completed hunt is something the game does not spell out. What is clear is that she arrived at the Grand Cathedral without the safety net of the dream behind her. The game presents this as exhaustion. She's been doing this too long and knows it. But there is also something of resolution in it. She chose the shape of her last night, and she chose it in service of the principle that defined her entire life. The gesture beneath the crown. When Alfred completes his mission and kills Annalise, he teaches the player the raw gesture through his dialogue in the throne room. He is standing over the dismembered body of the last vile blood, covered in her blood, barely coherent, and he roars. A wordless expression of a completion that immediately reveals itself as hollow. He did the thing his master had spent his life failing to do. There is nothing on the other side of it. The roar is not triumph. It is the sound of a man discovering that the goal was the only thing giving shape to his life, and that achieving it did not give him a new shape. It only gave him a corpse and a rune, and the precise silence of someone who no longer knows what to do next. The city that Yharnam teaches. What every NPC in Bloodborne has in common, from Gehrman in his wheelchair to the chapel dweller on the floor, to Gilbert at his window, to Adeline in her shackled chair is that they were all, at some point, people who came to Yharnam or were born in it and were shaped by what the city required of them. Yharnam required compliance with the hunt, participation in the blood economy, acceptance of the church's terms, and silence about the costs. Some of them, Eileen, Jorah, Simon, broke from those requirements and were punished for it or died for it. Most of them complied and were consumed anyway. The city was not designed to protect the people inside it. It was designed to produce outcomes that the entities above it needed. Every NPC who failed to understand that in time is a monument to the specific, sustained violence of a system that presents care and delivers consumption. The dream we leave them in. By the time the final choice is made, whether to submit to Gehrman's offered mercy or push back and face him directly, the player has passed through dozens of lives, heard dozens of voices through closed doors and broken windows, carried brooches and music boxes and items that belong to people who are gone. The final fight, or the submission, or the transformation into something new and cosmic, takes place against the backdrop of all of it. The garden with its graves, the doll tending the flowers, the old man in the wheelchair still waiting, still ready to be kind in the only way left to him. Whatever the ending resolves, it cannot reach backward into all those stories and change their shape. The stories ended the way they ended. The dream continues. And somewhere in its perpetual false dawn light, the people who are part of it persist as the game allows them to persist. In the items they left, in the gestures they taught, in the weight of the specific silences that replaced them when they stopped speaking. The triumph gesture and what it costs. The Uden Chapel Dweller teaches the player the triumph gesture, a raised fist celebration, after the first survivor is successfully sent to the chapel. It is the only celebration in the game given freely, without irony, without a twist in the questline ahead. He is just happy that someone came. He expresses this happiness with a raised fist. In a game where almost every warm moment is complicated by what surrounds it, the Dweller's triumph is notable for being exactly what it appears. One creature genuinely pleased that another creature showed up. The workshop that trained them all, the Hunter's Workshop in the Hunter's Dream, contains the workbenches where weapons are upgraded and the storage where excess items are held. It is functional. It is practical. It is also, structurally, the most directly maintained memory in the game. Every time the player upgrades a weapon or manages their inventory, they are doing it in a space that is Gehrman's memory of where he used to train hunters. The act of sharpening a blade in the dream is the act of participating in a memorial, whether the player knows it or not. The wheelchair he cannot leave. Gehrman's wheelchair is, at first glance, a detail of infirmity. An old man who can no longer walk, confined to a chair. The peg leg implies a prior injury, some violence the hunt inflicted on him before the dream claimed him. But the wheelchair also functions as a symbol of the trap itself. He is not merely sitting in a chair. He is fixed in a position, unable to move freely through the space he tends, circling the same areas of the garden in the same patterns he has always circled. The chair that holds him is not the source of his imprisonment, but it rhymes with it. The formless Uden and his chapel, the Great One. Uden is unique in Bloodborne's cosmology for being entirely without physical form, a presence rather than a body, something that exists as influence and resonance rather than as matter that can be perceived or touched. His tomb is directly above the chapel ward. His name appears on walls throughout the area. The chapel dweller, who tends the space below his tomb, drops a formless Uden rune. The woman the game believes is his vessel gives birth to something cosmic in the aqueduct below. Whedon's relationship to the chapel and the survivors gathered there is never stated directly, but the accumulation of details suggests that the refuge Yharnam's survivors found in that smoke-filled room was never fully separate from the attention of the entity above it. The doll's position by the tombstones. The plain doll sometimes moves. On returning to the hunter's dream after a long hunt, carrying a large quantity of blood echoes, she can be found standing beside one of the tombstones rather than at her usual position near the stairs. She is simply standing there looking at the grave. No dialogue explains this. No item describes it. She moves to the tombstones when the hunter is carrying what the game reads as significant weight, and she stands beside them the way someone stands beside a grave when they want to acknowledge that something is lost. Whether she is acknowledging the hunter's potential death, or mourning the hunter's already buried, or simply responding to the weight of what is being carried, the game declines to specify. The Alfred who could have stopped. Alfred had a choice at every stage of his quest line. The player can give him the unopened summons or not. The player can visit the throne room after Alfred acts and either witness his state or leave him to it. The game does not force the outcome. What Alfred does, the killing of Annalise, the kneeling death outside the church, is something he does because of what he is, not because the game's script required it of him. This is one of From Software's most consistent design convictions. Characters make choices that are consistent with their nature, and the player's role is to either assist or observe those choices, rather than prevent them. Alfred was always going to end up kneeling by that crown. The player's choices determined only how much they saw of the path that took him there. The impurity that drove Yamamura mad. The word impurity has a specific meaning in Japanese Buddhist and Shinto tradition, kegare, that refers to a ritual or spiritual uncleanliness, a state of contamination that requires ritual purification before normal social and religious activity can resume. Yamamura was an Eastern warrior operating with this cultural framework. When his League oath allowed him to see the vermin writhing in all living things, he was not simply gaining a new perception. He was being shown kegare, impurity, at a scale and density that his entire worldview told him should not exist and could not be cleansed. The revelation was not just intellectually overwhelming, it was spiritually shattering in a way that required the specific cultural context he carried to fully register. He stared into impurity itself, in the exact sense that his tradition gave that word, and it broke the categories through which he had understood everything. The Madara's twin, left behind. There is a younger Madara's twin who appears in the Forbidden Woods with a whistle that summons a giant snake, an enemy that presents as a hostile NPC encounter. The twin is connected to the Madara snake, a creature with its own dense lore around the relationship between the Madara's family and the great snakes of the Forbidden Woods. The twin attacks the player if they kill Volta, suggesting a loyalty to the League that complicates the otherwise simple picture of the snake charmer as hostile. This minor figure carries the implication of a much larger story about the Forbidden Woods, the snakes that inhabit it, and the families who built relationships with them. A story the game gestures toward without fully telling. The graveyard that keeps growing. There are more tombstones in the hunter's dream, garden, than there were hunters visible during the events of the game. The graves represent the accumulated dead of the entire hunt. Every hunter who ever passed through the dream, going back to the first time Gehrman made his bargain, and the workshop became a sanctuary of a specific kind. Players can interact with some of these tombstones to access memories, moments from previous hunters' encounters with bosses, available as optional summons. These summons are literal fragments of people who are buried in the garden where you level up. The flowers growing between the graves are not incidental. The garden is a cemetery that decided to remain beautiful, tended by an old man who could not leave it, and a doll who had nowhere else to be. The Healing Church's many arms, the NPCs of Bloodborne, collectively map the organizational structure of the Healing Church in ways that no single document makes explicit. Eileen represents the Hunter of Hunters Covenant, independent from but adjacent to the Church. Alfred represents the Executioners, the Church's enforcement arm for questions of heretical bloodlines. Brador represents the Church Assassins, the covert operation for suppressing inconvenient knowledge. The Hunters of the main game represent the Sanctioned Hunters. The Scholars in Bergenworth represent the founding intellectual tradition the Church grew from and then superseded. Simon represents the internal dissent that the Church eventually killed. Every layer of the organization is present in the NPC cast. What is absent from any of it is the population of ordinary Yharnamites who went to the blood ministers for help and received instead a slow transformation into the beast the hunters were hired to kill. The kin blood the dweller drops. When the player strikes the Uden Chapel dweller, he drops kin blood. This is a category of blood in Bloodborne associated with entities that have moved toward the cosmic, toward kinship with the Great Ones, rather than remaining fully human or transforming toward the bestial. The dweller's blood is not human blood or beast blood. It is something else, something that has already oriented itself toward the entities that the Church spent decades trying to approach through elaborate and costly means. He sits on the floor of a chapel named for a formless god, burning incense, gathering survivors, dropping kin blood when struck, and asking only to be your friend. What he is beneath all of that is not something the game fully resolves, but the blood he carries suggests it is something the world would not easily classify. The Vicar, who was already consumed, Vicar Amelia, the enormous golden beast the player defeats in the Grand Cathedral, was once a human woman, a high-ranking member of the Healing Church, who held one of its most visible positions of authority. She's praying when the player enters, crouched over the lunarium key in an attitude of genuflection. The prayer she is reciting, about seeking the old blood, about the night of the hunt, about cleansing impurity, is a Healing Church prayer, the same one that justified all of the organization's most terrible decisions. She prayed until the thing the blood made her could not pray anymore. By the time the player arrives, she is the prayer's subject, rather than its speaker, a creature of beasthood still performing the ritual of a faith that consumed her. The scourge that came from the sea, the events at the fishing hamlet, the origin point of the scourge's worst escalation, ripple through the NPC cast in ways that are not always obvious. Maria was there. Brador's existence is downstream of it. The curse that Koss generated is what produced the Hunter's Nightmare, where he is imprisoned. Simon's questline leads there and ends there. Each of the DLC's major characters is drawn back toward the hamlet in one way or another, because the secrets the Healing Church most wants buried are the ones that originated there. Koss is never encountered living. The consequences of her death are encountered everywhere. The Mikolash chase, the structure of the Mikolash fight, the player chasing him through corridors while he runs until he is cornered in a small room where the real fight begins, reflects something true about who he is. Michaelash has been running for a very long time. He ran from Bergenwerth when Willem's approach was insufficient. He ran from the waking world into the nightmare when the Mensis project took him past the point of return. Even in the boss arena, he is still moving, still refusing to stand still and be held to account for what he pursued. He's the most mobile of Bloodborne's major bosses because mobility was always how he related to authority, by refusing to stop long enough to face it directly. The constable's set, Walter's attire, the constable set, is named for what he was before the beast he ate transformed his understanding of the world. He arrived in Yharnam as law enforcement, as someone whose authority derived from civic institutions. The set is still what he wears, long after becoming the Beast Eater and then the Master of the League. He kept the clothes of the constable even after his constable's life ended. Either he saw continuity between who he was and what he became, or the clothes themselves had become a form of testimony, a reminder of the man who walked into Yharnam before the beast and the vermin and the League, when he was simply someone doing his job. The summons bell and the cooperative hunt. Several NPCs can be summoned as cooperative phantoms to help fight bosses. Eileen can help with the cleric beast. Alfred can assist with the blood-starved beast. Walter can be called for Ludwig. Yamamura can stand alongside the player against the living failures. The ritual of summoning these allies, ringing the old hunter bell, calling their resonance into the space, is presented as a formal act of connection between hunters across whatever membrane separates the dream hunt from the waking world exploration. When Walter's phantom materializes beside the player in the river of blood, it is both tactical and thematic. The League's entire founding principle is present in the image. The hunt conducted with confederates, not in the solitary bloodlust that eventually consumes everyone who hunts alone. The nightmare that preserves the dead. The hunter's nightmare traps hunters who went blood drunk, but it also preserves them. Every old hunter encountered in the nightmare, figures in historical attire, wielding weapons from an earlier era, is someone who died in the waking world and continued in the nightmare, intact in their madness, still performing the hunt that consumed them. Simon found his way in while still sane. Yamamura entered and lost his sanity inside it. It is the healing church's archive of everything it preferred to keep buried. The hunters who became beasts, the knowledge that could not be permitted to surface, and the events at the fishing hamlet that generated the curse in the first place. The ending that completes the NPCs. The true ending of Bloodborne, the one requiring 3/3 umbilical cords, and the defeat of the moon presence, transforms the player character into an infant Great One cradled by the plain doll. She promises to take care of you. Gehrman is dead. The dream should be dissolving. She remains with something new that is also something very old, a godchild that will grow into whatever comes next. The doll, made by a man who wanted to approximate someone he had lost, built from grief and from care that bordered on mania, ends the game holding the future of the cosmos in her arms. Gehrman made her to ease his loneliness. What she became, the caretaker of a new Great One, the last figure standing in a space between worlds, wasn't anything he planned. It was what the love inside the mania eventually produced, operating on a scale he could not have imagined when he sewed the first stitch of her gown. The wheel that became a weapon. Alfred's weapon of choice is the Ligarius's wheel, a massive spike device whose item description states it was wielded by Martyr Ligarius's band of executioners and used to slaughter the Vile Bloods at Canehurst. The weapon draws visually from the historical breaking wheel, a real instrument of execution used across medieval Europe, and the executioners appeared to have adopted both its form and its symbolism. The wheel represents what they called righteous destiny. Alfred wields it with a devotion that is equal parts religious and personal. It is not simply a weapon. It is a statement about where Alfred's authority comes from, what tradition he sees himself continuing, and how he understands the violence he does. Every swing of it is, in his mind, his master's arm extended through him. He is the wheel's motor. Logarius is its meaning. The Pythumeриan queen, beneath, the deepest chalice dungeons lead eventually to Yharnam. Yharnam, the Pythumeриan queen, an ancient figure who represents an earlier version of everything the Healing Church later tried to formalize. She is the blood queen of the old labyrinth, and the trophy description for defeating her calls her the blood queen of the old labyrinth. Her relationship with Uden predates every institution and every scourge by an indeterminate span of time. She shares certain pale aristocratic visual features with Ariana and Lady Maria, a resemblance that, given what we know about Cainhurst's lineage and the Pythumeриan origin of much of Yharnam's bloodline, could imply a shared ancestry connecting these women across centuries. The game draws no explicit line between them, but the accumulation of visual and thematic echoes suggests the resemblance is not coincidental. The claw mark on Gilbert's body. When Gilbert transforms after the blood moon rises, the creature he becomes drops the claw mark rune, a rune that increases the damage dealt by visceral attacks. This is a rune associated with hunters, with the brutal intimacy of countering an enemy's stagger with a devastating close-range strike. That Gilbert, who never fought, who gave his weapon away unused, who came to Yharnam to be healed rather than to hunt, should become a creature carrying a hunter's rune. This is one of Bloodborne's quietest, most precise ironies. He did not choose the hunt chose him anyway. The way it chose everyone who came to Yharnam looking for something other than combat, and it left its mark on him in the only language it knows. The Covenant of Compliance. The Cainhurst Vilebloods Covenant kneel before Annalise, swear an oath, receive the corruption rune, is the only major covenant in the game that requires the player to literally bow before another character before it can be joined. Every other covenant involves an exchange or a request. Annalise requires a gesture of submission first. She will not speak to the player unless they kneel. She dismisses them if they stand without kneeling. In a game full of proud, driven, self-determined characters, this makes the Queen an anomaly. The one figure who requires that you acknowledge her authority before she acknowledges your presence. The gesture is the door, and there is no other door. The gestures that tell the story. Across every NPC questline, the rewards include gestures, physical animations the player character can perform. They are not mechanical benefits. They do not make the hunter stronger. They are social acts, forms of communication the game's world uses to say things that words cannot cleanly say. Eileen's approval gesture. The Uden Chapel Dweller's Triumph. Alfred's Roar. Walter's League Oath. Annalise's respect, and then deep respect. Each gesture is the residue of a relationship, something a person gave because of what you did or who you were to them. The gestural vocabulary of Bloodborne is the social history of its NPCs, compressed into movements that persist long after the people who taught them are gone. The city that was always ending. Yharnam's NPCs do not appear in a static world. They appear in a world completing a collapse that has been underway for decades. the burning of Old Yharnam already happened. The schism between Willem and Lawrence already happened. Gehrman already made his contract. The fishing hamlet already burned. The events the player participates in are the last night of a process set in motion long before their arrival. The NPCs are the people who survived long enough to still be present at the end of it. The remnants, the holdouts, the ones who had not yet been consumed by what consumed everyone else. Each of them is, in their own way, a final report on a civilization that decided what it valued and then paid every price that valuing it required. Their stories are the invoice. Alfred's first gesture. The first thing Alfred gives the player, before the questline has advanced at all, before Cainhurst, before Annalise, before any of what is coming, is fire paper and the prayer gesture. The prayer gesture is a formal bow, hands folded, head lowered. It is the gesture of the executioners, a posture of devotion, and Alfred teaches it freely to any hunter willing to cooperate with him. He is not being strategic about it. He is simply sharing the shape of his faith, the physical form that his commitment takes. The gesture will outlast him. The player can go on performing it long after Alfred has knelt in the street outside the church and stopped moving. The prayer continues even when the man who taught it is gone. The skeptical man and the tonsil stone. The skeptical man in Cathedral Ward is not simply stubborn. He has an unusual relationship with Patches. After Patches occupies a red lantern window in Yharnam, the skeptical man gains an additional interaction. Speaking to him at the right point in progression allows Patches to effectively impersonate an NPC at the skeptical man's location. This creates a situation where the game's most famous deceiver and the city's most resistant skeptic briefly occupy the same narrative space. One offering a stone that leads to an amygdala ambush, the other too suspicious of everything to be easily manipulated. That the tonsil stone still works on players even after meeting the skeptical man's distrust says something about the power of Patches' presentation, which has always been more about timing and framing than outright lies. Eileen's approval. When Eileen thanks the player for helping her defeat Henrik at the Tomb of Uden, she teaches the approval gesture. A small, measured nod of acknowledgement that communicates what she cannot quite bring herself to say warmly, because warmth is not her register. She is an old woman who has spent too long on the wrong end of the hunt to be effusive about her gratitude. The gesture says, "You did a thing worth doing, and I noticed." She also acknowledges in the same breath that the player must have already killed Father Gascoigne, because Henrik would not have been there otherwise. Even in thanks, she is cataloguing. Even in gratitude, she is working. The League staff and the mark of purpose. When Volta recruits the player into the League, he gives them the League staff, a plain walking stick that is also the mark of a Confederate. It has no combat function. It is simply the item that signals membership, the physical token of having sworn the oath and accepted the vermin-crushing mission. When Valter eventually disappears after 5 vermin have been crushed, leaving only his iron helm, the League staff stays with the player. They now carry both the tool of the mission and the hat of the man who led it. The League has no master anymore. The player is the master. The vermin are still there. What happens next is entirely up to them. The Forbidden Woods and its keepers. The Forbidden Woods is one of Bloodborne's densest concentrations of NPC encounters. Valter in the locked hut near the first lamp, the suspicious beggar on the windmill balcony, the younger Madara's twin near the giant snakes, Patches occupying red lantern windows after the player enters. Every single one of them is dangerous in a way that is not immediately apparent. The woods are not simply a hostile area to traverse. They are the game's clearest statement about what happens when hunters, beasts, great snakes, and cosmic middlemen all occupy the same space without any organizing authority to separate them. It is what Yharnam looks like when the institutions that manage the violence stop managing it. The night Eileen chose. Eileen arrives at the Grand Cathedral grievously wounded because the bloody crow of Canehurst was too much for her. But she had the choice to walk away, to let this one go, to survive past her last mission. She does not take it. She went into this encounter knowing what she was up against, having tracked hunters long enough to recognize when one is beyond her capacity. She went anyway. What that says about her is difficult to put into a single word. It is not recklessness. She is too careful for that. It is not martyrdom. She is too pragmatic. It is closer to the old, quiet understanding that some things are worth finishing even when finishing them costs everything. Eileen did not stumble into her final night. She chose it with both eyes open, in the same way she has chosen every other night of a very long career.